Hey everyone, it's EJ from Eyedesyn.com, and I'm back with another tutorial, and this one's going to be on how to recreate this text fracture transition that you'll probably recognize from the X Games promotion commercials that aired last year. And in it they have visuals of all these cities all over the globe that X Games was being held, and they have the word of the town or city, and it fractures up and transitions into the next city with new visuals behind the 3D text. So this is what I'm going to be going over today, and the main thing is going to be how to really sell this seamless transition from one word to the other. Because if I play this out, you can see that you really don't notice when it goes from one word to the other, except when the color changes. But all in all, it's a pretty seamless transition effect, and that's really going to sell what we're doing here. So let's just go ahead and dive in. So we have our MoText object here with the word London, and we're just going to make this about a 2-second animation. And first thing we need to do is actually just keyframe this word to go from London to Paris. So it's as easy as just going to, say, frame 15, and we're going to set a keyframe for our text on our text field on our MoText object. Go one frame down to 16, and we'll just type in Paris. And we'll hit another keyframe. So now we have London to Paris. So now we have our text transitioning, and now all we have to do is add the distortion to this. So to distort our text here, our MoText here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use a displacer deformer, and we're going to make this a child of our MoText object. So nothing happens when you apply it, and that's because you need to define some kind of shading to actually drive the distortion on our object here. And the thing we're going to use is just go into our shader, and we're just going to use some noise to distort. So now you can see a little bit of distortion going on that's being created by our noise here, and these black and white values in our noise. So we're going to change our noise from noise to a gaseous type of noise, and we're going to bring the octaves down. We don't want it too detailed, and we're going to bring the global scale up to about 200, and we're going to change the animation speed from 0 to about 0.5. And when I hit play, you can see that we have just a little subtle, very subtle distortion going on, or animation added to our distortion, just to give it a little bit more interesting, kind of organic, fluid motion to it. So let's go back in our displacer. We're good with our shading and our noise. Let's go back into our displacer properties here, and we're going to bring up the height from 10, which is pretty small, and we're just going to jack this up to about 400. So right now it's like really crazy and not what we're looking for at all. But if we just tweak a few more things, we'll get a little bit closer to the look that we want. So we're going to change the type from intensity centered to just normal intensity. And you see that brought that back a little bit. And if we go to our direction, right now it's using vertex normal. If we change it to spherical, and if I go to my top view here and move our displacer deformer back and just kind of center this up with the center of our text here, which is about, let's see how high our text is. So it's about 200 centimeters high. So if we move our displacer up about 100 on the Y, that should be basically the middle of the vertical height of our text. So as we move this around, you can see that it's using spherical distortion to apply our distortion to our noise distortion to our text, and it's looking a little bit closer to what our final product looked like. The next thing we need to do is actually give this some fall off, so we can control when this actually starts distorting as this displacer deformer comes through it. And we're just going to use a spherical fall off, and we're going to bring the scale up to, say, 500. So now we have our spherical fall off. Now if I move our fall off back in Z and bring it forward, you can see that we're starting to see the beginnings of this fracture transition. So if I bring this forward, bring the fall off forward, then bring it back, you can see that this is where we're going to keyframe. We're going to have the word London go to Paris, and then it's going to come back, the fall off is going to come back, and it's going to form the next word. So let's just go ahead and actually keyframe our displacer fall off. So let's start at about frame 5, and we're going to go and hit a keyframe on the Z, and then around frame 15, where our text changes from London to Paris. I can actually bring up our timeline here so you can see that. Alright, so we have our keyframe of our text here, and there's our displacer keyframe. So let's just go ahead and in our displacer move it forward in Z space. So here's our text right here. We're going to kind of get this fall off pretty close to encompassing all of our text. So right there is about good. So we can hit a keyframe there, and then about frame 30 we can move the fall off back so it's not affecting our text at all, and hit another keyframe on the Z. So now if I hit play, so we have our displacer fall off moving forward and distorting our text, and in the middle of that we have our keyframe on our text that's going from London to Paris, and that is occurring right at the highest amount of distortion from our displacer. And then we have our distortion fall off leaving, displacer fall off leaving, and we now form our Paris word. So we can actually go in here and adjust the displacer curve so we get a little bit more dynamic movement. Maybe give this a little bit of ease here, and give a little bit of ease off the top as well, and like really have a really sharp point in our curve. Right, maybe move this down so the sharpest point will be right where that London to Paris keyframing happens. So now let's see what that looks like. Let's just bring this to 30 so we don't have to keep playing to 60 frames. So that's looking pretty good, but we can still see there's definitely a jump there that we can notice. So what we can do next is kind of distort this motext even further. And the one thing we can do is if we go into and add a connect object, and we're just going to throw everything in a connect object. And what a connect object is going to do is, number one, give this nice like Phong shading here, which gives a kind of cool effect. But we're going to actually change our Phong mode from brakes to manual, and we're going to also play around with our tolerance here. We're going to turn textures off and just apply this there. Apply the texture to our connect object. You can see if we have textures working now. Okay. So, right. Let's go back to our tolerance. You can see as I jack up this tolerance, it's kind of simplifying our geometry till we are getting less and less polygons. So this is kind of what we want. So what we can do is, if we scrub back and forth on our timeline, you can see that while this tolerance works for these middle frames here with our highest distortion, once our text goes back, or our distortion goes back, we're still left with less polygons due to our connect object. So what we're going to do is, in the middle of our highest distortion here, we're going to keyframe this tolerance at about 70 here at frame 15, and then once our distortion goes back to nothing, so once our distortion leaves, we're going to actually take our tolerance to 0. So our word is going to form itself again, and our tolerance is going to be at 0, so we see the fully all the polygons on our Paris object, so our connect object won't be affecting it anymore. So we can go back and around frame 5 do the same thing and hit a keyframe for a tolerance of 0. So that's looking good in the center, but it's not looking really great right when the tolerance and distortion is starting at the beginning and towards the end. We're getting all these janky polygons going on, and our center of our words here, or our letters here, are filling in, so you can't even really read it, and it's not giving a seamless transition from one to the other. So the one thing we're going to do on top of all of this is go and on our MoText object add a display tag, and we're going to go and activate or check the level of detail, and I'm going to bring the level of detail to 50. So what that's going to do is bring down the level of detail on our object, or simplify the polygons, kind of like how the connect object is. But you can see as we go further towards the beginning of this, where it was looking a little bit janky, it's looking a lot better. We're getting less polygons that are distorting, and you can still make out the words, and it's looking pretty cool with this really sharp distortion. So you can see the difference between the 50 detail and the 100%. So when we bring this down to 50, that leaves the holes, and it's very like abstract letters, and that's the kind of look that we're going for. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a instance of this text, because we're going to have to keyframe visibility from one to the other, because if I render this out, this is going to be, the level of detail is still going to be 50%. So I'm just going to, for organizational sake, I'm just going to create a instance of this text, and I'm just going to apply all the distortions to that MoText object, and make sure that we bring this display tag and apply it to just that MoText instance. And I'm just going to bring this texture tag and copy it to the original MoText object. So now what we're going to do is actually fade from our original non-distorted MoText object and change the visibility and fade into our distorted MoText instance. So let's add another display tag here, and for this one we're just going to use the visibility, and so about frame 5 is when we're going to switch from one to the other. So we're going to keyframe the visibility to from 100% to 0%, and then on our MoText instance with our other display tag, we're going to activate the visibility and keyframe that. So this one, on this frame 6, we have our display tag on our undistorted text 0. This will be 100. And if we move back a frame, we'll keyframe this, the distortion or the instance object, to 0. So now we're switching. At frame 6, we're switching from the undistorted to the distorted instance there. And we're gonna go back to our connect object and uncheck the textures, because we have some little weirdness going on with our textures not being applied to everything. So we're gonna go to about, let's see, frame 27, and we're gonna switch back from 100% visibility to 0. and we're going to actually we need to apply this to our connect object, sorry, and now we can bring back our, let's see, and now we can bring back the visibility of our original text here. So we're going to set a keyframe that's going to go from 0% and have our undistorted text come back at full visibility. So now if we go and play through this, we have our nice distortion going on, and this is much more fluid in our transition from one to the next with our connect object kind of simplifying our polygons, and as well as changing the level of detail so there's less polygons. So now we see we have this nice seamless transition from the distorted polygons back to the undistorted text here. So the last thing we can do is make this even more fluid of a transition, and we can do this by going into our motext instance here, and we're just going to go and make a delay effector and make that a child of our motext instance, and we're going to make sure we apply this delay effector below the displacer. So our displacer is going to happen and then our delay effector. So we're going to change the mode, we're going to keep the mode, we're going to keep it at blend, and let's just bring the strength to about 65, and in our deformer we're going to change the deformation from off to point. And now when I hit play, this is actually going to blend and smooth out the movement of the points of these polygons on our motext instance here. So you can see with it off and with it on. So let's maybe bring this up even more so we can really exaggerate the smoothness here. So you can see how it smooths everything out. That's a little bit too much. We'll just bring it back to 65. So you can see it's just a subtle difference, but I think it adds a lot right there. And the one thing you can do that's kind of optional is, as I was playing around with how to get this distortion looking good, I even went and saw how placing everything under a cloth surface looked. And if I just drag my motext instance underneath the cloth tag, change the subdivisions to 0, and bring the thickness to 2, so we have a little bit of thickness to our polygons, you can see how it looks with and without. So I think this makes it look a little bit cooler, more dynamic, a little bit more distorted. If I hit render here, in my texture here I have gradient and illuminance, and I have ambient occlusion on our diffusion channel, so we have this nice shading going on between our polygons. So now we have our transition from London to Paris, and the nice thing is that if we need to, say we need to do another set of cities, let's do Dublin, and hit a keyframe, and say we're going from Dublin to Munich, and we'll hit another keyframe. So right now that actually automatically updates with our instance, because that's gonna copy everything we're doing with our motext here. So now we're going from Dublin to Munich, and you can see that it's still relatively a smooth transition from one word to the other. Alright, so let's go ahead and render this and see what we got. Yes. So we have our distortion coming in, but you can see we have a lot more polygons than we thought. So let's just actually, let's stop it right there. Say yes. Alright, so let's take frame 8 for example here. See how we have frame 8 in our render and frame 8 in our viewport? How this is much less polygons. The reason for that is because when you're using display tags to adjust the level of detail on your objects, when you go to render, it's not going to work like that, and that's because you need to go into your render options, and right here you have this use display tag LOD, and what that is it means use display tag level of detail. So what this is going to do is, by default when you render, it automatically renders everything at 100% level of detail, regardless of how many tags you have on it and how low you adjust your level of detail. But when you check this on, this actually renders using the level of detail that you set on your display tag. So now if you go and render this again, we'll say yes. Now we have the correct level of detail, and it's looking like it does in our viewport because of that use display level of detail. So just something to keep in mind when you are adjusting your level of detail on your display tags, and when you go to render, it's not looking correct. Make sure you have that options checked on. Alright, so we have our renders finished, and we're going from Dublin to Munich. So we have our distortion being driven by a displacer object with a circular fall off, spherical fall off. We have more distortion happening by using a connect object to kind of blend the polygons together to make it more of a seamless transition from one piece of text to the other. And we have delay effector added with set to blend, with the deformation set to point, to make our animation distortion blend a little bit more and make it a little bit more organic in the animation. And that's how I figured out how to kind of recreate that X Games text fracture transition.